number of years ago, a completely unknown writer named Julie Powell began a series of food essays she called the Julia Project that she recorded on a personal blog site. Each day, Powell blogged about her attempt to cook all 524 recipes from Julia Child's best-known cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. To make things even more interesting, Powell gave herself the challenge of preparing every one of those dishes in a single year in her tiny New York apartment kitchen. The sheer enormity of Powell's task gained her a tremendous following. In turn, this success got her a book deal, and eventually the project became Julie and Julia, a blockbuster movie that starred Meryl Streep as Julia Child. Then there's a nature essayist named Michael P. Branch, who is a professor of literature and the environment at the University of Nevada. Branch decided to start writing a blog he called Rants from the Hill. He and his family live on what he describes as a desiccated hill mercilessly exposed to wind, snow, and fire. And the rants, or blog essays, that come from this hill are all comic environmental essays about living life in the high desert. Branch received such an enthusiastic response that not one but two publishers decided that he was worth the risk and gave him the opportunity to publish his essays in book form. The books are called Rants from the Hill, The High Life Out West, and Raising Wild, Becoming a Father in the High Desert. Branch has also recorded his essays as podcasts, or rather, rantcasts. So what can essayists learn from Julie Powell and Mike Branch? Well, whether you're a well-established scholar and university professor like Branch, or a young and ill-paid government employee like Powell, a blog can be a powerful way to circulate your essays to a wide audience. Now that said, I also want to point out that not all bloggers get lots of readers, and many blog posts are not at all what I would call essays. Instead, a lot of the time, blog posts are raw, unedited material. They consist of journal entries, tirades, or daydreams. So let me spend a little time distinguishing between online life notes and fully formed blog essays. Because if you're going to take your essay drafts and put them out there on the interwebs, it's important that you write the best dang blog essays that you can. A number of my current and former students keep blogs. When they travel abroad to India or Peru, when they're collaborating on a class project, or when they're working on a writing project of their own, they sometimes use blogs to motivate themselves. Blogs are a good way of sharing ideas with friends, family, and fellow students. Andrew McDowell, a young man who calls himself an aspiring author of young adult fiction, is one of my former students. He's currently working on a first novel about a young boy who finds himself, his brother, and a group of friends drawn into a mystical realm of magic trees and wild plants and animals, where they will stumble upon the revival of an ancient coven. Now, in the hopes of connecting with other young adult writers and to spur his own creativity, Andrew started a blog. His first post was a piece called, Why Do I Write? With this post, Andrew was actually participating in a long tradition of writers who write about their writing, called Ars Poetica, or the art of poetry. In these kinds of pieces, a poet explores the act of writing poetry within the bounds of a poem itself. In this way, Ars Poetica are self-referential. They are poems about poetry. Ever since the Roman poet Horace composed the first Ars Poetica sometime between 20 and 13 BC. Some authors have tried to explain the basic principles of their art through this form of writing. In addition to Horace, there's also Alexander Pope's Essay on Criticism, Lord Byron's Don Juan, Billy Collins' a poem called Workshop, and a well-known example by Archibald MacLeish that he actually entitled Ars Poetica. Now, in a broader sense, any statement about writing that occurs within a piece of writing itself is a kind of ars poetica, although maybe we should call it ars scribendi, or the art of writing. What distinguishes the ars scribendi form is that an author is usually introspective about his own writing process, and he might compare or contrast his work against the historical framework of a certain literary form or according to current tastes and fashions about literature. So, Andrew's blog post on Why Do I Write signals his desire to craft an ars scribendi. He considers the question of whether he's chosen the best genre for himself. He dives into his childhood and adolescent writings, and he gives credit, where credit is due, to his parents, friends, and fellow young adult enthusiasts. All that said, though, while Andrew's ars scribendi is a noble undertaking, his blog post doesn't yet rise to the level of the literary. And that's because he isn't writing a blog essay. Instead, he's just writing a blog post. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Andrew writes, "I have always enjoyed the challenge of weaving words together. It has given me a sense of purpose outside of work. I write because I alone drive myself to reach greater heights. But I am not alone. Were I alone, I might have crumbled. Sharing my experiences with family, friends, and fellow writers brings out my confidence, my belief that I can do this. And I admit there have been times when I've been consumed with doubt that I will never be any good. In my yearbooks from middle school onwards, even before I took writing seriously, many peers and teachers encouraged me to keep writing. Even today, people say that if my work ever appears in print, they can say that they know the writer. While such talk makes me smile, I have to remind myself that fame and fortune are not the motives of a true writer. I must bear in mind my father's advice to me: tell a good story, and tell it well. Without this motive, I don't think it's possible to be a good writer. I must continue challenging myself to tell a good story that I wish to share with others in the hope that they will love it and remember it." So as you can see, Andrew's desire to become a good writer is real and heartfelt. He's reaching for something beyond the quiet tedium that can arise from schoolwork or an everyday job. And he understands that to become a true artist, you can't hope to make a bunch of money and get famous, like Julie Powell. The sage and witty essayist Anne Lamott explains this in her own Ars Scribendi, which is a book entitled Bird by Bird, Some Instructions on Writing in Life. Lamott says, "People want to be published. They kind of want to write, but they really want to be published. But you'll never get to where you want to be that way. There is a door we all want to walk through, and writing can help you find it and open it. Writing can get you to start paying attention, can help you soften, can wake you up. But publishing won't do any of those things." So certainly Andrew is on the right track. There's a door he wants to walk through, and it's one that takes him into a fantasy world where griffins talk to young boys in magical forests and adventure awaits. Andrew also hopes that someday other readers will want to walk through this door with him, that they will come to love and remember the good story he wants to tell. And that's great. It's terrific. And perhaps of greatest importance, Andrew is willing to practice. He's been writing ever since he was a boy. He took creative writing workshops in college. And now he seeks support and feedback, in part by starting a blog about his writing. But even though Andrew is trying to be a better writer for a whole host of really good reasons, this blog post still isn't an essay. It's just not a true Ars Scribendi. And that's because his piece is like a cross between an author bio and a journal entry. Andrew's not yet writing about anyone other than himself or anything other than his own struggles. And his purpose isn't to reflect on the bigger picture of what art and artistry might mean to his readers or to his culture. So let's juxtapose the passage we just looked at from Andrew's blog with a paragraph from Lamott's Bird by Bird. And while I know that in some ways this comparison isn't fair, I want us to hear from a successful writer on why it's important to tell a good story and to tell it well. As Lamott explains, books help us to understand who we are and how we are to behave. They show us what community and friendship mean. They show us how to live and die. They are full of all the things that you don't get in real life. Wonderful lyrical language, for instance, right off the bat. And quality of attention. We may notice amazing details during the course of a day, but we rarely let ourselves stop and really pay attention. An author makes you notice, makes you pay attention, and this is a great gift. So this quotation comes from a chapter in Bird by Bird about how to get started as a writer. And the reason that this chapter rises to the level of an essay, to the level of an ars scribendi, is because it's not exclusively about Anne Lamott's own fears and limitations. It's also not a laundry list of advice to young writers. Now, I'll admit, it's true that Lamott touches on self-loathing and petty jealousies in the book, and her own paralyzing fear that nothing she ever writes is ever any good. It's also true that she offers up certain chestnuts to young writers, such as, good writing is about telling the truth, and start with your childhood, and remember that you own what's happened to you. But Lamott is thinking about that greater purpose behind making a bunch of black marks on a white background. That writing is really for readers. It's an art form for others to see and to understand. For one, Lamott says that writing is miraculous, which it is. Or in the words of Stephen King, writing is a form of telepathy. Now, King says this in his own Ars Scribendi, a wonderful book called On Writing. In it, he states, all the arts depend upon telepathy to some degree, but I believe that writing offers the purest distillation. When you read my books, we're not even in the same year together, let alone the same room. Except we are together. We're close. We're having a meeting of the minds. In other words, one person can make symbols with a sharp rock or with ink or with a few strokes on a keyboard, and another person can see those symbols and crawl inside the mind of someone else. And that person who reads and understands these symbols can be a few or hundreds or thousands of years down the line from that writer who held that rock, who clutched that quill, or who banged away at that computer. Lamott also talks about empathy in Bird by Bird, about how readers empathize with those worlds and people who unfold out from what she calls small, flat, rigid squares of paper. If we readers stand inside someone else's shoes and look through their eyes, think their thoughts, and feel the meat and bones of their bodies, then we have a real chance at coming to appreciate, as Lamott says, what community and friendship mean and how to live and die. In addition to the magic and empathy of writing, Lamott also touches on the wonder of a writer's style. How he reproduces people and places, objects and ideas in a way that no one else ever has or ever will. Books are all about an author's voice and attitude, which Lamott describes as lyrical language and quality of attention. So a writer's quirky imagery and diction, as well as his luscious details and descriptions, make us notice things that otherwise we would surely ignore or miss altogether. Let me try to say this one other way. Anne Lamott cracks her essays open, wide, wide, wide. Her focus is not on personal issues, top 10 lists, or the unfiltered and unreflective opinions that dominate so many blog posts that masquerade as essays. Lamott is interested in something more. She's interested in the magic, the empathy, and the artistry of writing. Okay. So is it possible for bloggers to write real essays and to write them consistently? Absolutely yes, I believe that it is. In addition to the examples I've already touched on of Julie Powell and Michael P. Branch, let me introduce you to the work of a colleague of mine named Robin Bates. Bates started a political and literary blog a few years ago that he calls Better Living Through Beowulf, How Great Literature Can Change Your Life. Its premise is simple. He wants to consider how classic literature contains philosophic theories and also true-to-life lessons that have the power to help ordinary people work through their psychological and emotional dilemmas. In the Better Living Through Beowulf blog, Bates explains how certain pieces of literature have assisted him over the years. In particular, he writes, "Works of literature have come to the rescue at moments of unimaginable pain. When my oldest son died in a freak drowning accident, I turned to Beowulf and to Sir Gawain in the Green Knight. Neither made the trauma go away, nor did I expect them to, but they provided me some relief in seeing the grieving process as a journey, not as a mindless thrashing around. And additionally, I've been privileged to see scores of students use literature to wrestle with their most profound issues, including divorce, heartbreak, identity crisis, and death. In teaching them how to use literature in this way, I see myself providing them with essential life skills." Although Bates is a full-time English teacher and an active member of his campus and church communities, he writes a blog essay each and every day. And that's now thousands of entries and counting. So let's get back to the question of whether it's possible for bloggers to write true essays and to write them consistently. Well, almost all of Robin Bates' pieces are essays and not just blog posts. That's not only because he's a well-trained writer and a long-term teacher of writing. It's also because he pays attention to his audience and to the purpose of his blog. While he draws on his own life experience, what he witnesses or reads, what he's teaching, or what's circulating in American popular discourse, his blog essays also spur the reader's own thoughts. These essays take into account what matters to his readers, not just what matters to Robin Bates. And his central point is to move, educate, inform, and generally launch conversations with his audience. Over the years, the most popular posts on Better Living Through Beowulf have been Bates's politico-literary essays about topics such as a Democratic president, the Republican Party, and Shakespeare's King Lear. In this particular example, Bates linked Lear and the angsty dynamics of power politics in Washington to the question of whether the United States should make an arms deal with Iran. Bates's blog essays combine classic literature with real-world political issues, and they were so successful that he decided to pull some of them together and self-publish a book. This book is called How Beowulf Can Save America, an epic hero's guide to defeating the politics of rage. And in it, Bates includes a series of essays that come together to form a larger argument. His argument is that the same monsters we find in Beowulf are present in America today. They are the enablers in the political class, as well as the cynical and self-absorbed 1%. Bates believes that Beowulf and his monster-fighting tactics from the original epic poem provide a kind of blueprint for combating the great challenges facing America and for reclaiming the promise of a society that ensures justice, equality, and a good life for all. In essence, then, Robin Bates's blog became a way for him to write the first draft of a book of essays, just as Michael Branch's blog helped him get a contract for his essay collections, and Julie Powell's blog became the Julie and Julia phenomenon. Bates, Branch, and Powell all used online forums to spark their thinking and to practice their craft. So we might think of their blogs as test kitchens or laboratories or think tanks that allowed them to work through political, environmental, and culinary ideas and challenges. So, okay, if you decide to try your hand at keeping a blog to nudge and hone your own writing skills, you might do so with an eye to using it as a kind of online collection of essays. Your essay drafts won't be in a drawer. They won't be buried on a computer. Instead, any audience you attract will start generating comments to help you know which of your blog essays work, which don't, and why. And this feedback can then help you revise and polish your essays, And maybe, like Powell, Branch, and Bates, you might be able to turn your blogs into artistic and maybe even monetary successes. Now, having said that, I would be remiss not to point out that Branch and Bates both kept their day jobs as teachers in order to make ends meet. So while blogs are a good way to get your essays out the door, they don't necessarily guarantee you fame and fortune. Okay, so let's close this lecture by considering another publishing path. It's the path of having your work peer-reviewed, meaning reviewed by experts in the field of the essay, who themselves are published writers or scholars, literary agents, or editors. But just before I get into peer-reviewed publishing, let me take a step back just for a moment and talk a bit more about self-publishing, which is in essence what a blog is. Now, self-publishing means that your work doesn't pass through the hands of a literary agent or a professional editor, and it's not necessarily read by other essayists or peers before you hit the send button. Now, self-publishing certainly has its merits. If you keep a blog, or if you record free podcasts, or produce your own book of essays through websites such as Amazon or Lulu.com, you have complete control over your work. You're not beholden to an agent, an editor, or a publicist. But that said, self-publishing has its drawbacks as well. And the drawback I most want to talk about is the potential lack of informed critical comments before you publish. Whether for better or for worse, fine writing is really about revision. First you draft your essay, then you revise it, and then you revise it again. There are no shortcuts. And successful revision usually requires the kind of tough, thoughtful, critical commentary that's most likely to come from a teacher, a mentor, a professor, a professional editor, or an agent. So the danger of self-publishing is you won't have anyone who can really give you the kind of feedback you need to revise your essays so that it's really, really good writing. On a blog, you might get a thumbs up or a thumbs down from commenters, and sometimes you might get a reader who wants to talk through your arguments, which can be helpful in hashing through the validity of your ideas. But generally speaking, you're not going to get skilled readers who can assist you in seeing what to keep in your essays, what to get rid of, and how to extend or to hone what's left. That's the kind of thoughtful, critical commentary that comes with peer review. And while I'm not saying that the peer-reviewed literary marketplace is perfect, it certainly is not. It's the one that I myself have chosen for my own published essays. And that's because I've always wanted the best feedback I could get on my writing. And that really only comes from experts in the field. So, how can you begin to participate in the world of peer-reviewed publication? One assignment that I give my own essay writing students is something I call a review of the market. You might consider doing it yourself. I ask my student writers to visit the websites of 10 different journals that publish creative nonfiction essays. And I specify that these journals need to be small print ones. This means that the slicks, such as the New Yorker, Harper's, and the Atlantic, are not allowed. And that's because I want my students to become more familiar with the world of creative nonfiction journals that aren't as well known, but which are producing some of the most innovative and excellent pieces of writing out there. And how do you discover the names of these kinds of journals? Well, every year, a volume of the best American essays is produced under rotating editors. So I have my students buy this book and thumb through the table of contents to see pretty quickly what journals they should check out. Also, at the back of each Best American edition, there's a list of 100 fabulous essays that weren't selected for that year's volume, and where each of these essays was published. So this, too, is a good list of journals for you to consider. Once my students decide on their 10 journals, I ask them to visit each one's website, to read at least a couple of essays to get a feel for the kind of creative nonfiction that they publish, whether that's literary, lyrical, regional, public intellectual, nature essays, travel essays, or polemical ones. I also expect that my students will look up specifics about how to submit their work to these journals, and I ask them to consider questions such as, when does the journal come out? How often? How many essays do the editors accept every year? Do they pay anything for publication? Who is listed as the editor-in-chief or the creative nonfiction editor? Do the journals encourage submissions from writers who have never published before? Do they accept longer pieces or just short essays? And do they also accept parts of longer works, such as memoirs? Then, after my students have taken notes on each journal, I ask them to write up their review of the market. Their task is to convince me why they've chosen these particular journals and how they see their work operating in this market. I tell them to be savvy and to be specific. I also tell them that they should get used to making this kind of review at least once a year. Doing your homework is still the best way to know where to send your writing. Beyond this review of the market for small press journals, if you're hoping at some point to shop a collection of your essays, then it's worthwhile to invest in a copy of the current writer's market and to look at websites for university presses. The two collections that I've co-edited, Books That Cook, The Making of a Literary Meal, and From Curlers to Chainsaws, Women and Their Machines, were both published with university presses. University presses don't have the depth and breadth of resources that a Simon & Schuster or a Bedford St. Martin's might. But they do have dedicated, supportive staffs that are a joy to work with. University press editors are much more likely to give you feedback on your book projects than editors at commercial houses. And their catalogs don't cycle through books as quickly, meaning that your essay collection is more likely to stay on their list for many years to come. And then there is the question of getting an agent. If you hope to have name recognition on the scale of Julie Powell, then you will have to have an agent. Yeah, I'm afraid it's a fact of the writing life. Now, I got a New York agent only after a dozen years of publishing essays and short stories. I didn't make this contact on a cold call. I had to show her a portfolio of my work. But when you're ready and have a few pieces under your belt, then by all means, page through the writer's market, read the descriptions of each literary agency carefully, and send polite query letters to possible agents. And that's pretty much the sum total of my suggestions on how to circulate and publish your essays, but with one caveat. I've said that writing is revision, but it's also rejection. I myself get about 3 rejections for every acceptance, and I hold on to these rejections as reality checks. Sometimes I even pin them above my computer as reminders. A reminder of what? Well, that the writing world is a fickle one. You'll never please all of the readers all the time, and that includes both agents and editors. The advice I give my students about how to grow a thick skin against rejection is this. On the very same day that you get a rejection, turn around and put that puppy back in the mail. Don't wallow, don't whine, don't rage or rail, and certainly don't procrastinate. Another editor out there might think your essay is the best thing since sliced bread. So send it back out immediately and watch your skin grow a tough new layer. Now, will publication change your life? Is it going to solve all of your writing tics and insecurities? Will it make you more attractive, a better dresser, more poised, and more wealthy? No, 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 and probably not. And yet, we wouldn't write if we didn't want to share with others what we have to say. So write. Just write. And when you're ready, post that essay on a blog or put it in the mail. And tell yourself, as Emily Dickinson did, "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me."